In recent YouTube short, Jason DeCosta claims that Jesus only came for descendants of Abraham. In his presentations, he conflates two distinct questions: to whom the promises were originally made and how those promises were fulfilled. Yes, the promises were made to Abraham and his seed. No one disputes that. What Jason assumes, but never demonstrates, is that Abraham's seed always and exclusively means biological descendants. The Torah itself does not permit that reduction. It repeatedly provides a covenantal mechanism by which genuine foreigners could lawfully attach themselves to Israel per Exodus 12:40, 8:49, Numbers 15:15, Deuteronomy 2, Numbers 12:40. They did not become biological descendants of Abraham, but they did become participants in Israel's covenant life, making them part of Israel's covenant community. Neither Jesus nor Paul is ever portrayed investigating people's ancestry before recognizing them as covenant participants. Genealogy simply isn't presented as the criterion by which covenant membership is determined. Jason also assumes that Paul's phrase, the fullness of the nations, to pleroma ton ethnon, in Romans 11:25, means the complete number of Abraham's physical descendants. But Paul never says that. The text says, the fullness of the nations, not the fullness of Abraham's biological seed. Jason has inserted those words into Paul's argument. His interpretation appears to depend on connecting Romans 11:25 with Genesis 48:19, where Ephraim's descendants are described as becoming a fullness of nations. Even if Paul intended an allusion, however, the argument still falls short. Paul never quotes Genesis 48:19, never introduces it with "as it is written," never identifies the fullness of the nations with Ephraim, and never even mentions Ephraim in Romans 11. An echo is not the same as an interpretation. Paul frequently draws on Old Testament language without importing every element of its original context. The wording alone does not establish identity. Moreover, Romans 11 itself never defines either the fullness or the nations as the complete number of Ephraim's biological descendants. If Jason wishes to make that claim, the burden is on him to demonstrate it from Paul's own argument rather than assume it. Even if Romans 11 does allude to Genesis 48, it would still need to be shown why that allusion excludes proselytes, God-fearers, and other covenantally attached members of Israel. Paul never makes that exclusion. In fact, Paul's theology consistently shifts the emphasis away from biology and toward covenantal union. Galatians 3:29 does not say, if you are biologically descended from Abraham, then you are heirs. It says, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. The criterion Paul gives is belonging to Christ, not proving one's genealogy. Likewise, Romans 4 calls Abraham the father of all who believe, while Romans chapter 6 distinguishes physical descent from the children of promise. Throughout his letters, Paul argues that God's promises reach their fulfillment according to God's covenantal purpose, not by tracing bloodlines or counting chromosomes. Jason's interpretation therefore assumes the very conclusion he is trying to prove. He must demonstrate from Paul's own words that the fullness of the nations means the complete number of the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Paul never says that. He speaks of the fullness of the nations, and throughout his letters he consistently defines heirship covenantally rather than genetically. Therefore, the claim that Jesus came only for the biological descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob goes beyond what Scripture itself states. Jesus came for Israel, but Israel, as the Torah defines it, included both native-born Israelites and covenantally attached foreigners who had lawfully joined themselves to Israel's God. The real question, then, is not whether the promises originated with Abraham's descendants. They unquestionably did. The question is whether everyone who ultimately shared in those promises had to prove biological descent from Abraham. Neither the Torah, the prophets, Jesus, nor Paul ever says they did. Jason's position depends upon reading an unstated biological restriction into passages that never express one. The covenantal inclusion model of I.O. does not. It simply follows the covenantal categories already established in the Old Testament and carried forward into the New Testament. It recognizes that God's redemptive work remained focused on Israel's covenant community while acknowledging what the Scriptures themselves repeatedly show, that this covenant community included people who were not Abraham's biological descendants but had lawfully become participants in Israel's covenant life. Until Jason can point to a passage where Jesus or Paul explicitly excludes proselytes, God-fearers, or other covenantally attached members of Israel solely because they lacked Abrahamic ancestry, his conclusion remains an assumption rather than an exegetical demonstration.